In 1888, an Egyptian farmer was digging in the sand near the village of Istanbul Antar. He was not looking for anything in particular. He was turning earth. Then his shovel hit something. He cleared the sand and found himself looking at a body wrapped in linen. Then another. Then another. Not one or two here and there. Dozens. Hundreds. Hundreds of thousands. A layer of them packed into the ground like a geological stratum, 10 to 20 deep. They were cats. Ancient cats, mummified with the same care and precision the Egyptians had used on their pharaohs. Some still had gilded faces. Some were wrapped in geometric linen patterns so precise they looked machine-made. The farmer had stumbled into what would turn out to be one of the largest mass burials ever discovered on Earth. Not of humans, of animals. And the number that emerged from that single site near Istanbul Antar was only the beginning, because beneath the sands of Egypt, spread across at least 31 known cemeteries from the Nile Delta to Upper Egypt, scientists have now confirmed the presence of approximately 70 million mummified animals. 70 million. Cats, dogs, birds, crocodiles, baboons, snakes, fish, beetles, rams, and species that no longer exist in the Egyptian landscape. The question is obvious. Why would any civilization commit that level of effort, that volume of resources, that scale of organized labor, to preserving the bodies of animals? The answer, when DNA and modern imaging finally provided it, turned out to be far more complex, far darker, and far more revealing about ancient Egyptian society than anyone had anticipated. The story begins not with the animals, but with the gods. Ancient Egyptian religion operated on a principle that no modern Western framework fully captures. The gods were not abstract. They were not distant figures confined to myth. They were present physically in the world, and their preferred vessels were animals. Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and the moon, inhabited the ibis, a long-beaked wading bird that stalked the marshes of the Nile. Bastet, the goddess of home, fertility, and protection, took the form of a cat. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of death and embalming, lived in dogs and jackals. Horus, the god of kingship, occupied the falcon. The Egyptians did not worship the animals themselves. They understood the distinction, but they believed that the spirit of the god, the Ba, was present inside the animal, and that killing, mummifying, and offering that animal to the god was the most direct form of communication a person could achieve with the divine. You did not pray into silence. You purchased a mummified animal, handed it to a priest, and the priest buried it in a catacomb in your name. Your message was carried physically inside the body of the god's representative into the earth where the divine and the mortal met. The system worked like this. Pilgrims arrived at temple complexes along the Nile, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles. Festivals dedicated to specific gods drew hundreds of thousands of visitors. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded that the annual festival of Bastet at the city of Bubastis attracted 700,000 people, arriving on crowded boats, filling the processional routes with music and dancing. When they arrived, they needed an offering, and the temples were ready. Priests had become salesmen. Stalls operated outside the temple walls selling pre-wrapped mummified animals at every price point. Simple wrappings for the poor. Elaborate linen work with painted features and gilded faces for those who could spend more. The faithful ended their journey by delivering their chosen mummy to the temple with a prayer. Cure my illness. Grant me a child. Settle a dispute. Protect my harvest. The mummy carried the message. The priest collected the offerings and buried them in underground catacombs, stacking them floor to ceiling, corridor after corridor, chamber after chamber, until the tunnels ran for miles beneath the desert. At the necropolis of Saqqara alone, archaeologists have mapped catacomb systems that held millions of individual animal mummies. The ibis catacombs, the falcon catacombs, the baboon vaults, and most staggering of all, the dog catacombs dedicated to Anubis, where researchers from Cardiff University estimated that nearly 8 million mummified dogs had been deposited over the centuries. 8 million dogs in a single catacomb complex. The number requires a moment. These were not natural deaths accumulated over millennia. This was industrial production, and the implications of that production are where the story turns. The ibis tells it most clearly. At the site of Tuna El Gabel in Middle Egypt, archaeologists have recovered approximately 4 million mummified ibises from a single catacomb system. 4 million birds, individually wrapped, individually deposited, be stacked in ceramic jars that fill underground corridors stretching hundreds of meters in every direction. At Saqqara, another 1.5 million ibis mummies were found in a separate catacomb. Ancient records from the Temple of Thoth indicate that at one point, 60,000 living ibises were being held at Saqqara simultaneously, waiting to be killed and mummified. The temple was producing roughly 10,000 mummified ibis offerings per year. The question that immediately followed was obvious. Where were all these birds coming from? Were they being bred in captivity like livestock? Or were they being captured from the wild? For decades, the assumption was farming. The numbers seemed to demand it. No natural population could sustain that level of extraction. Centralized breeding operations must have existed, and industrial hatcheries producing birds for the sole purpose of ritual slaughter. The assumption was reasonable. It was also wrong. In 2019, paleogeneticist Sally Wasif of Griffith University in Australia led a team that extracted DNA from 40 mummified ibises dating to approximately 450 BCE. The samples came from 6 different catacomb sites across Egypt, including both Tuna el Gebel and Saqqara. The ancient DNA was then compared against 26 genetic samples from modern sacred ibises living in wild populations across sub-Saharan Africa. The sacred ibis is now extinct in Egypt. It disappeared from the country around 1850, centuries after the mummification practice ended. But the species still thrives in wetlands south of the Sahara, which gave researchers a living comparison population. The results overturned the farming hypothesis entirely. The mummified birds showed genetic diversity nearly identical to that of modern wild populations. And if the ibises had been bred in captivity over generations, the genetic signature would have been unmistakable. Inbreeding narrows genetic diversity. Factory farming produces populations with reduced variation and increased susceptibility to disease, a pattern visible in every modern industrial breeding operation. The ancient ibises showed none of that. Their DNA was as diverse as birds living free across the African continent today. Wasef's conclusion was striking. The priests had not been farming these birds. They had been luring them. The temple complexes at both Saqqara and Tuna el Gebel are situated near natural wetlands and seasonal flood basins that would have attracted wild ibis populations. The priests likely used food to draw the birds into controlled areas near the temples, capturing them from the wild and holding them briefly before sacrifice. The system was not agriculture. It was organized hunting on an extraordinary scale, sustained across centuries, drawing from wild populations that were large enough to absorb the extraction without immediate collapse. But not indefinitely. The sacred ibis eventually vanished from Egypt entirely. The DNA cannot say with certainty that the mummification industry caused the extinction. But a practice that removed millions of birds from the ecosystem over a 1,000-year period is not a practice that leaves no trace. Then the DNA opened a different door entirely, one that led not inward to Egypt but outward across the Red Sea to a place the Egyptians called Punt. The land of Punt appears in Egyptian records from the earliest dynasties onward, described as a wealthy trading partner to the south and east. Punt supplied Egypt with incense, gold, leopard skins, and one commodity that mattered enormously to the priesthood: baboons. The Hamadryas baboon was sacred to Thoth, just as the ibis was. Temples maintained living baboons as divine representatives. Their mummies have been found in catacomb systems at Saqqara, at the Valley of the Monkeys near Thebes, and at other temple sites. But baboons have never lived naturally in Egypt. There's no evidence they ever did. Every baboon that appeared in an Egyptian temple had to have been imported. And the Egyptians said those baboons came from Punt. The problem was that nobody knew where Punt actually was. The name appears in trade records spanning more than 1,000 years, but no map has ever been found. No coordinates. No precise geographic identification. Scholars debated the location for over a century and a half. Somewhere in the southern Red Sea region. But that covers an enormous area, from the Arabian Peninsula to northeast Somalia to Eritrea to Ethiopia. Nathaniel Dominy, a primatologist at Dartmouth College, realized that the baboon mummies themselves might solve the problem. If the baboons had been imported from Punt, and if their bones still carried chemical traces of the environment where they were born, then the mummies could function as geographic evidence. The method used was isotopic analysis. Strontium, a chemical element present in soil and water, varies in composition from location to location. When an animal drinks water and eats food from a specific region, the strontium signature of that region embeds itself permanently in the animal's teeth during early development. Bone and hair reflect more recent environments, but the teeth lock in the birthplace. Domini's team analyzed strontium and oxygen isotope ratios from mummified baboons held in the British Museum and the Petrie Museum. They compared the results against isotopic data from 155 modern baboons sampled across 77 locations in eastern Africa and southern Arabia. 2 mummified baboons from the New Kingdom period, dating to roughly 1550 to 1069 BCE, produced a clear result. They had not been born in Egypt. Their isotopic signatures pointed to region encompassing modern-day Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. The baboons had traveled across the full length of the Red Sea to reach Egypt. The implications were immediate and significant. Egyptian sailors during the 2nd millennium BCE were capable of maritime voyages far longer and more complex than many historians had credited them with. Then in 2023, geneticist Gisela Kopp of the University of Konstanz pushed the investigation further. Her team extracted actual DNA from a mummified baboon found at the Valley of the Monkeys, a site dating to around 800 to 500 BCE. For years, paleogeneticists had told Kopp the attempt was futile. The mummification process itself destroys DNA. The chemicals, the heat, the resin, all of it works against genetic preservation. She tried anyway. From 10 mummy samples, only one yielded usable genetic material, but that single sample told a remarkable story. The mitochondrial DNA matched most closely with baboon populations from coastal Eritrea, precisely the region where the ancient port city of Adulis once stood. Adulis was a major trading hub between roughly the 1st and 7th centuries CE, well known from Greek and Roman sources as a center for the trade in wild animals. But Punt predates Adulis by more than 1,000 years. The DNA suggested something that historians had speculated about, but never proven. Punt and Adulis may have been the same place, the same stretch of Eritrean coastline, known by different names across different eras. A single baboon mummy preserved in an Egyptian catacomb had provided the strongest geographic link ever established to a kingdom that vanished from the historical record more than 2,000 years ago. While the DNA was rewriting trade history, imaging technology was exposing something else entirely inside the mummies themselves. In the largest study of its kind, researchers at the University of Manchester used CT scanners and X-ray machines to examine more than 800 animal mummies collected from sites across Egypt. The mummies dated between 1000 BCE and 400 CE and included cats, birds, crocodiles, falcons, and shrews. The expectation was straightforward: animal-shaped wrapping, animal inside. The results were not straightforward at all. Only 1/3 of the mummies contained complete, intact animal remains. Another third held partial remains, sometimes just a single bone, and a fragment of skull, a few vertebrae. And the final third contained no animal material whatsoever. No skeleton, no bone, no tissue. Inside the carefully wrapped, elaborately decorated linen bundles that pilgrims had purchased as sacred offerings to the gods, there was mud, sticks, reeds, eggshells, floor sweepings from the embalmer's workshop. One mummy shaped like a cat held only a few loose pieces of cat bone rattling inside a shell of linen and resin. Others were completely empty organic material packed into the shape of an animal and sold as the real thing. The immediate question was fraud. Had the ancient embalmers been running a scam? Selling fake mummies to pilgrims who could not see what was inside the wrapping? The researchers at Manchester did not think so. Egyptologist Lydia McKnight, who led the study, argued that the materials used as fillers were not random. Eggshells, feathers, nest material. These were items that had been in close contact with the sacred animals during their lifetimes. The Egyptians may have considered them carriers of the same divine essence as the animals themselves. A feather from an ibis carried the ba of Thoth, just as the bird's body did. The wrapping, the ritual, the intention, these were what mattered, not necessarily the completeness of the physical contents, but there is another explanation that the scale of production makes unavoidable. Demand outstripped supply. 70 million animal mummies across 31 known cemeteries over a period spanning more than 1,000 years represents a level of industrial religious production that no natural animal population could sustain indefinitely. And the embalmers needed product, the pilgrims needed offerings. When the animals ran short, the workshops improvised. Professor Salima Ikram of the American University in Cairo, one of the world's foremost authorities on Egyptian animal mummies, put it directly. The real mummies were expensive and hard to come by. If you wanted a baboon offering but could not afford or obtain a real one, the embalmers would make something that looked like a baboon and tell you it was a baboon. And in the Egyptian belief system, that was enough. If a priest declared it sacred, it became sacred. The wrapping transformed the object inside, regardless of what the object actually was. The CT scans revealed something else that the DNA could not: how the animals died. The imaging showed that many of the cats found in temple catacombs had been killed deliberately, and X-rays revealed fractured cervical vertebrae consistent with strangulation or having their necks broken while they were still young, most under a year old. The British Museum's examination of cat mummies in their collection confirmed that the majority had not died of natural causes. The temple catteries bred cats specifically for the purpose of ritual killing. Periodic culls produced batches of mummies for sale. The same pattern appeared across species. Baboon mummies showed evidence of malnutrition, bone fractures, vitamin D deficiency, and the removal of their canine teeth, the large, dangerous fangs that make baboons formidable. The teeth were extracted as a safety measure so the animals could be handled in captivity. The skeletons told the story of animals that had lived confined lives in dark enclosures, deprived of sunlight, and fed inadequately and killed when the priests required offerings. The crocodile mummies held their own revelations. One specimen scanned at Manchester, measuring 5 feet in length, was found to contain not one crocodile, but 9. 8 baby crocodiles had been carefully prepared, bound together, and packed inside the wrapping alongside the mother in a single large mummy shaped like an adult crocodile. Whether the babies had been killed alongside the mother or collected separately and combined for the mummy's construction is unknown. But the care taken in arranging them was evident. This was not careless work. It was meticulous, deliberate, and organized around a system of belief that required death on an industrial scale. The cats may be the most revealing case of all. In 1888, the same year the farmer at Istanbul Antar made his discovery, a shipment of cat mummies was loaded onto a vessel bound for Liverpool. The cargo weighed 38,000 pounds. It contained approximately 180,000 individual mummified cats. The buyer was not a museum, it was not a collector, it was a fertilizer company. The mummies were ground into powder and spread across English farmland. 180,000 sacred animals, wrapped and blessed and offered to Bastet across centuries, pulverized into agricultural supplement. The practice was not unique. Throughout the 19th century, animal mummies were treated as bulk organic material. Entire catacomb systems were emptied and sold by weight. The number of mummies destroyed before modern archaeology could examine them is incalculable. And what remains is still enormous. And the DNA extracted from what survived continues to produce results that reshape our understanding of ancient Egypt. The ibis DNA proved that the mummification industry operated not on farming, but on sustained wild capture, a revelation about the relationship between Egyptian religion and the natural environment. The baboon DNA traced a trade route across the Red Sea and located a kingdom that had been lost for 2 millennia. The CT scans exposed a production system that operated on a scale comparable to modern industrial agriculture, complete with breeding programs, mass killing, quality tiers, and a secondary market in counterfeit products. Together, these findings describe something that the word religion alone does not adequately capture. This was an economy, an infrastructure, a national industry that employed animal keepers, breeders, hunters, embalmers, priests, linen workers, and laborers who built and maintained underground catacomb systems stretching for miles. The animals were the raw material, the gods were the market, and the pilgrims were the consumers, purchasing access to the divine at whatever price point they could afford, trusting that what they were buying was real, or at least real enough. The sacred ibis no longer exists in Egypt. It disappeared from the Nile marshes around 1850. The Hamadryas baboon is gone. The populations that once filled the wetlands and the temple enclosures and the catacombs beneath Saqqara are extinct in the Egyptian landscape. The animals that an entire civilization believed carried the souls of their gods were consumed by the very system built to honor them. 70 million mummies, 4 million ibises at a single site, 8 million dogs in a single catacomb, 180,000 cats on a single ship. The numbers are not metaphors, they are counts. And beneath them, sealed in linen and resin, and the chemistry of 2,000 years of burial, the DNA still holds sequences that have not yet been read, from species whose stories have not yet been told, in catacombs that have not yet been opened. The ground beneath Saqqara still holds millions of mummies that no researcher has examined. The questions the DNA has already answered about trade, extinction, fraud, and belief are significant. The questions it has not yet been asked may be larger still. The animals carried messages to the gods. The DNA is carrying messages to us. We are only beginning to read them.